When Rabbi Shira Stutman was 10 years old, she got in a cab with her mom after visiting the home of one of their wealthy friends. As she looked out the window when they arrived at their perfectly nice home, Rabbi Shira said, "I always feel so poor when I come back here." Her mom snapped. In fact, she snapped in a way that Rabbi Shira had never seen before. But that's not the story. The real story is what happened a few hours later when her mom came back, apologized, and said, "I think I snapped because I was feeling a little shame too." That moment, the honesty, the awareness, the beautiful emotional repair, it stayed with Rabbi Shira, and it shaped how she thinks about class, privilege, and what money reveals about us. This conversation knocked my socks off, not because it was shocking, but because it was so deeply thoughtful and, frankly, surprised and changed me in some really important ways. Greetings, this is Carl, and you're listening to another episode of 50 Fires, a podcast about money and meaning and the things that really matter. Today, my guest is Rabbi Shira Stutman. Rabbi Shira is the founding rabbi of the 6th and I Historic Synagogue in Washington, D.C., and she currently serves as the rabbi in residence for the Aspen Jewish congregation. She's known for translating ancient Jewish wisdom into our modern lives. And in this conversation, she does exactly that with money. So let's dive into my conversation with Rabbi Shira. So, Rabbi Shira, where I'd love to start is really at the beginning. And I'm curious about your first or earliest memory of money.
Oh, so money was always something that we spoke about in our home very openly. My parents had professional careers. My dad was an attorney in the government, and my mom is a therapist. And they spent most of their money on educating us kids. They had 3 kids who they sent to parochial school, which is not cheap all the way through. And so there were lots of conversations about money and values around the table. My dad's favorite joke was, if I didn't send you kids to Jewish day school, I could buy a brand new Jaguar every single year and drive it off a cliff. Right? So it's like from my earliest years, I understood that people, no matter how little or how much you have, you are actually making choices every day, and your values are reflected by the choices you make about your money. I also remember, I wonder if my mom even remembers this story, but she had, when we were growing up, a very wealthy friend who had a huge mansion in DC. And one day we went to visit her. And for some reason, we took a cab back to our house in DC after going to this mansion. And we pull up to our house. I should tell you, Carl, for the purposes of the story, I grew up in a lovely semi-detached house in Northwest DC. I had everything I wanted and needed. So we pull up to our house, and I'm in the cab, and I turn to my mom and I say, I always feel so poor when we come back to our house after visiting this person. And my mother snaps at me like I've never heard her in my life. She's not that kind of mom. How dare you? That's so rude. Get out of the cab right now. Go. So I went inside. I mean, I remember this partially because I still feel the shame about it. And a few hours later, to her credit, my mom came and found me, and she said, I need to apologize for the way I reacted in the cab. There were 2 things that happened to me in that moment. She said, first of all, I was thinking about the cab driver, who probably doesn't have a house as nice as ours. And so in you saying that, I was thinking not only of you, but also of him. And she said, and the second reason I have to apologize is because I think I had some of the same feelings as well, and I was a little bit embarrassed by them. right? And so instead of saying, I see you in this, she said it was her projection. No, you're a terrible child. And so those are just two, like off the top of my head, stories about sort of money and class and how those things worked and how we did and didn't talk about them in our family system.
That is amazing.
Yeah.
Your mother's ability to come back and have that. How old were you?
Oh, God. I mean, maybe I was 10, right? So it was about 40 years ago. It was so long ago. But I really remember, I can picture the cab driver. I can picture, and I'm not someone who carries my childhood. Picture the cab itself. It was like, it was like the 80s. It was very different. I can picture where on our street corner we were. And it was a really important pivotal moment for me because it helped me place myself in the world in a number of different ways at once. As a daughter, as an individual, as someone of wealth, because compared to the cab driver, I'm sure I was someone of wealth. As someone who was not as wealthy as, the person in that other house, it was just like a lot of things happening at once.
What do you make? I mean, I'm most sort of touched by your mother's ability to come back and talk to you about that. Because I remember catching myself once when one of my kids said that the neighbors must be rich because they just bought a new water ski boat. And I remember saying, like, that's none of your business. It wasn't quite as sharp necessarily, but it could have been. But I remember catching myself by seeing in the rearview mirror the look of confusion, sort of like, and I remember just say, like, tell me more about that. Like I gave myself some like some space by asking such a basic question, like, oh, tell me more. Like, why is that important to you? But your mom being that aware, was that unusual, or is that just how your mother was?
Well, first of all, I should say my mom is an extraordinary human being. And second of all, she is a therapist. So she sort of thinks about, she tries to have insights into other people all the time and, God willing, into herself. And what was really out of character for her was the snapping at me. Sure. So I think probably what happened, she was like, what the heck happened there? That was so weird. And so then she came back to me and we had the repair. But, also remember, and, when I talk about Judaism, I just want to say once, and I won't need to say it again, I never mean to imply Judaism and not other faith traditions. It's just Judaism is the tradition that I know.
Sure,
so, okay.
Sure.
So, yeah. And so in Judaism, there is a very serious practice of what we call in Hebrew tshuva, or repentance, or returning to right self, or reflection. So a practicing Jew's muscles of right setting should always be sort of somewhat strong. They aren't always, but they always should be somewhat strong. So maybe she also is sort of practicing some of that work that we try to do, often fail, but often try to do, during the Jewish high holidays and all year round.
Let's just continue that theme just for a minute. I'm curious about what you make of using that experience almost just as a metaphor of how quickly you can get hijacked around money stories.
Right.
Talk to me a bit about that.
When you talk about money, you're never talking about money, right?
Right.
I mean, talk about calculators and spreadsheets. 2 months ago, maybe it was 3, my husband and I were in our 50s, and we are starting to work seriously with financial planners, right? So we're on with our financial planner and his assistant and his assistant's assistant. There are like 45 people on this call. I don't know. And me and my husband. And we're going through our plans. And first, my husband and I say, we really want to give a sum of money to our kids when they graduate from college or a few years after that they can use for a down payment, for a wedding, for graduate school. But we want to be able to do it equally. We want to do it for all 3 of them. And the financial planner was like, no, that's not a good idea. Let's just wait and see how much money you have because my husband and I are people we are financially very well off, but we work for our money, as people have taught us to say, right? We're not wealth inheritors. So he's like, just wait until you see how you're going to end up financially and then give your money to your kids. So that was like one moment. We paused. And then like 10 minutes later, we're talking about tithing because my husband and I tithe, right? Every year we give 10% of our post-tax income to charity. And again, the financial planner was like, you know what? Why don't you wait till the end and then give whatever X percentage of money to charity? Don't do it now because you never know what's going to happen. And all of a sudden I'm like, oh, we're having a values-based conversation right now. We are no longer having a conversation about dollars and cents and spreadsheets and calculators. And that was when I was like, oh, I'm the rabbi. So it's like I turned to the financial planner and I'm like, I so appreciate you. I'm so grateful because your value right now is trying to protect us. Right? Your value is centering me and my husband, but we're not going to go that way. Our values are a little different. And to his credit, he was wonderful. He moved on like it was a bump, but it's so rarely about dollars and cents.
Yeah. So two things. One, I want to, let's go back just like 10 seconds ago. You said we work for our money. And then there was this disclaimer, as we're taught to say. What was that?
And I would love your help with this, Carl, because
that's what I'm here for.
Because like, my husband and I we're very well off compared to America. Yeah. And one of the things I worked on with my kids over the years is that they should know that we're pretty well off compared to America. Yeah. And I use the language of rich because we are compared to America, if not compared to the communities that they inhabit. Yeah. But the other thing that is true is that if my husband and I stopped working tomorrow, we wouldn't have an income that came. Sorry, I don't want to say everything we have because that is factually inaccurate. But the majority of what we have is because we're working for it. Now, it's not everything we have because we also have the backstop of our parents who paid for us to go to private school, who paid for both of our college educations entirely. So even if they're not financially supporting us in the current moment, they certainly did enough and they set us on a certain kind of path. So that's why I try to say we work for our money. We do. Yeah. But at the same time, if we stopped, we wouldn't have more coming in. Yeah. And second of all, that probably also is, as I'm trying to reflect and gain insight while I'm looking at you, there's probably also some sort of like a differentiator there for me about wealth and how it comes to you in this world.
Yeah. Does that, I just, if you're okay with it, I would love to just push just a little bit. I'm curious about, because this idea, this word that we use a lot that you're kind of pointing around of privilege and privileges and the place in which we were born and the education we get, all of those things, it's very hard to separate them from shame.
Yep.
How much of that sort of have you experienced, and B, like, have you seen in the work that you do?
Oh my gosh.
Like, how do we navigate this landscape a bit?
Carl, I hope one day we can really, I need more people to talk to about these topics that I spend a lot of my day thinking about. So part of my work is with wealth inheritors. So I run year-long programs around the country with cohorts of mostly Jewish Americans who are inheriting tremendous amounts of wealth and want to figure out how to be philanthropic in the world. So it's actually a specific group of people. These are the ones who are choosing to figure out philanthropy. And we spend a year together. And some of the time we do talk about like how to make good philanthropic choices. What's important to you? Is impact important? Is, all of those sorts. But we also spend a lot of time talking about shame and family stories. Because especially when you're a wealth inheritor, there are some people feel like they're not deserving. They don't want to talk about it. It's not their money. I'm putting that in scare quotes, right? They didn't make it. There are other, and And that manifests itself in all sorts of ways, right? Sometimes it manifests with aggression, like there is a sort of attitude of, no, I'm entitled. There's sort of an attitude of entitlement. Sometimes it manifests as not talking about the money at all, ever, which sort of leaves so many philanthropic dollars on the table, right? That really, for the good of the world, could be pushed out into the world. And so we create these cohorts of people who are, because, usually if you're inheriting $50 million, you can't go to the local bar and find someone to talk to about. People will not feel compassionate about that. But over the years, I've now worked with a few hundred of these young people, and I've developed real compassion for someone who's inheriting this money, because sometimes the money wasn't made in ways that feel ethically comfortable to the next generation. Sometimes the values of the next generation, the philanthropic values, are quite different. Sometimes, there is like a sort of one-upsmanship that happens where the next generation feels they have to work twice as hard to make even more money, but that's because they want to fit into the family system. There's so many ways that wealth inheritance can go wrong. And what's interesting is sometimes in these cohorts, the people that I'm working with are like, oh, let's slip in a wealth generator or two. Because if you're thinking of the primary goal of this program being about moving philanthropic dollars out into the community, then it doesn't matter if you're a wealth inheritor or a wealth generator, right? It's the same, it's money. But if you're thinking about it as giving people language and a community with whom to talk about really difficult things, then it actually matters a lot. And so there have been difficult conversations I've had with different cohorts as they've started to form.
So amazing. How does it show up for you? Like, even in that statement of like, we work for our money, like, how does it show up for you personally? Like, what have you learned? Those moments you have when you're the teacher and suddenly you're like, oh my gosh, I'm actually the student.
First of all, I call that parenthood.
or my day.
Seriously, all day, every day. It shows up in a few different ways. I don't carry a lot of envy toward people who are wealthier than I am, because
why? Why?
So I objectively do have a lot, first of all. Second of all, I see where the pain points are when you have, extraordinary amounts of money. I see where the possibility is, right? There is so much possibility, but it turns out that people with tremendous wealth are just like everyone else. I mean, they have to sometimes sometimes people with very little money have to make different sorts of decisions. I do understand that. I'm not an idiot. I live in the real world, but still, I don't carry the envy that I might have in the past. Like, I don't come home from the big mansions anymore and say, oh, my house is so small in comparison. It's just not. Isn't
it interesting? Just don't lose your train of thought. But it's so interesting to me how hard. That's like a universal thing we hear: more money, more problems. It's littered throughout all the wisdom traditions, right? I have a needle, camel, rich man, like everywhere you look. We just had Henry Shukman on, the Zen teacher. I asked him what was the one thing about money he still was scared of. And he said, I really don't think I could handle a lot of it. Like we hear this all the time. And then the rest of us are all like, I'd like to try that problem. But it turns out there's real it's a challenge. So I think that's just super fascinating. I don't want to lose your train of thought of how it shows up for you, but that envy, once you hear enough of these stories, you do lose that sort of envy or desire, right?
Yeah, but I do want to interrogate that a little bit. Look, I'm a rabbi, and I don't know all of Jewish text. I just want to say that, but I don't think in Judaism, poverty is not a value. Right? Poverty is not a Jewish value. And so Judaism holds less work, more problems. Like, Judaism is a very pro-work culture, civilization. Our legal texts have a lot about how to be in a workplace, which might be funny when you think about what a legal text should teach.
Yeah.
But I would want to spend another few hours with you talking about this after I study the text, but my gut reaction is Judaism is more money, more possibility.
So when I say it's littered throughout the wisdom traditions, you're essentially saying, well, actually, no, it's maybe the skill and the understanding of proper use, right? But not necessarily directly correlated to harder for a rich man to get into heaven than a camel to go through the eye of a
no,
needle.
we don't have that sort of stuff. And
Beautiful.
by the way, this is where Carl, and I do hope we get to this. This is where it becomes a little bit, this is where perhaps some of the hairs on my arms start to stick up, because here's the rabbi saying, Jews don't have a problem with money. That's half of what I'm saying. And then, then my brain starts like all the anti-Semitism alarm bells start going off, right?
It's wanted to ask you about this.
Wait, are we saying that Jews are rich? Are we saying that Jews love money? Yeah. Are we saying that? So it's like, no, I can say the first thing without necessarily saying the second thing. And I'm happy to talk about that more.
It seems like we could do that now. I'm really curious about this. This is one of the questions that one of our mutual friends suggested I ask, which was, Mormons and Jews are supposed to be good with money.
Yeah.
Which one of us should be more offended? Was sort of the funny version of that question. But talk to me, and where are those, where do those become harmful and dangerous tropes? And how do we navigate that language like you just pointed to?
Oh, it's such a hard and such a good question, because I spend a not insignificant amount of time thinking about what a shame it is that part of the tropes around Jews is about Jews and money, because I think Judaism is so much to teach about how to handle money in the world, but we hold back from teaching about it because of our own internalized anti-Semitism and our own shame around being subject to anti-Semitism. So here's what is true. Money is value neutral in Judaism. It's not a bad thing. It's not a good thing. We have a tradition that we are legally required to give between 10 and 20% of our annual income to what we call in Hebrew tzedakah. It's facilely translated as charity. I like to call it economic redistribution, but more right-wing people don't like it. But it's sort of it's supposed to be out. It's not just to the Jewish community. It's out into the world. And that the rest of our money is ours to enjoy. We're supposed to enjoy our life. Now, we're supposed to use it ethically. It's not ours to go out and spend it on cocaine or to spend, cheating other people, but it is ours to enjoy. And I think sometimes we don't talk about that because of the ways Jews have shown up around money, which is not our fault. It is the fault of leaders, of feudal leaders over the millennia living under Christendom. I don't think it was very Christian, their behavior. So I don't want to, but it was living under Christendom, who put Jews in a middle market position to be the money lenders, right? To stand between the actual people in power and the actual people who were powerless as the intermediaries, also known as sometimes the money lenders. The other thing about Jews is because we never knew which country we would be kicked out of next. We've been kicked out of so many. It's a real claim to fame. We often didn't invest our money in anything that wasn't movable. So often our income was kept on our person or in our, easy to take from one place to another. It was made into jewelry, for instance, which we could easily use to bribe people as we were going from one. But we weren't landowners for much of Jewish history because if they were kicking us out, we were gone. The other thing is that for a large part of Jewish history, there were only certain careers that we were allowed to take part in the outside world. We were only allowed to be money lenders. We were only allowed to be bankers. One of the reasons that there are so many Jews in Hollywood is because when Hollywood first was starting, there were a lot of types of careers on the East Coast that Jews were not allowed to partake of. They weren't allowed to be lawyers. So they had to go out and start a whole new industry. And so the relationship between Jews and money is really complicated, and to a large extent, it's not our fault, right? The way that we have been so connected to being money grubbing for so much of our history.
We'll be right back with more from 50 Fires. Welcome back to 50 Fires.
Carl, I thought you reminded me of a good story, if that's okay.
Please.
So, I used to work at a place in Washington, D.C., a synagogue called Sixth and I, like the number 6, the letter I. And we had a program called Interfaith Couples Workshop, where we would bring in couples where one partner was Jewish and one was not. And one of the things we would ask them to do is to write a case study about something that was live in their relationship. And then the whole group would discuss it. we once got a case study that was written by, the guy was not Jewish, the girl was Jewish, and it was all about how when the couple gets together with the woman's family, the Jewish family, all they do is talk about money. And in the guy's family, his waspy family, they never talk about money. It's money is something that is not seen, not heard. No one talks about it. And it feels culturally, it's not just culturally different. It feels culturally off-putting. And he said, it's not just when we're with her family. It's when we're with her friends. He said, why do Jews talk about money so much? And like when we all read this case study, everyone in the room was like, oh, because like this non-Jewish guy had put this sacred cow in front of everyone. Jews and money. Jews talk about money all the time in front of everyone. But it led to one of the most important conversations I ever had as a facilitator of this interfaith couples workshop, because we said the quiet part out loud. It is true that culturally Jews will talk a lot about money. How much you paid for this, what percent off you got it, how much they're making at their new job, how much more so-and-so is making, why so-and-so chose to do, this profession, which makes less money than that profession. So, and that comes from a very enmeshed ethnic community where everyone feels they have a right to be in everyone else's business. But it also comes from the fact that like we talk about money so we know who has it, where it is, how we can raise more of it for philanthropy. That's also a big part of it. And also who has a hold of it for epigenetic reasons of trauma.
What useful lessons came out of that conversation? Like, how do you talk about that like stereotype or trope gets thrown around? How do you address it? What do you say?
I think one lesson that came out is just talking about money is value neutral, right? Like we can talk, the idea that talking about money is somehow dirty, right? Or somehow should be private. That's not necessarily true. You might have been taught that in your family. That's fine, but it's not. Why? Being secretive about money is never good for the poor. It's only good for the rich, right? So teaching number one, if you want to talk about it, talk about it. Teaching number two can be, if you don't want to talk about it, you don't have to talk about it, right? It's not it's not that. But teaching number three is, I think, that Judaism does have a lot. My next book that I want to write, I have a chapter in my current book about money, but my next book I want to write is all about money and values and how we need to talk about it more for the good of this universe that we inhabit. So I guess that was another lesson that came out. Just talk about it. And your religion probably has something to say, whether and in Judaism, it's okay to like learn against your religion, meaning Judaism has a lot to say. It's more concerned with you learning than it is with you agreeing about what it has to say.
Tell me about that, the values thing. There's a line in your book, every penny made and every penny spent is a reflection of our values. And then there was another one, financial planning is as much about exploring our values as it is about maxing out our IRAs.
Yeah. So I'll start with the second one. The second line, right? So financial planning is entirely about our values because, when my kids were very lucky to go to an independent school, a private school here in Washington, D.C., and when the school's, I don't know, about half Jewish, 40% Jewish. And when the age of 12 and 13 started coming around, those are the ages of bar and bat mitzvahs. They're basically Jewish coming of age ceremony. And what often happens, especially in America, where Jews are so proud to get to live free as Jews, you will have a massive party around a bar or bat mitzvah. So, there have been many, many comedy movies made about this, right? So my girls are turning 12, my son's turning 13, and we have to sit them down and say, look, your bar and bat mitzvahs are coming up. Dad and I have made a choice. Because we tithe, that takes up a huge part of our annual income. It does. And because of that, we are not going to be able to throw you a bar or bat mitzvah that is as fancy as your friends. And we say, Your friends' families might have fancy bar and bat mitzvahs for all of their own reasons. They might have just had a massive loss in their family, and this is the first time everyone's coming together, right? It might have been very difficult for this young person to learn the Hebrew, and they really want to celebrate them, right? We worked really hard not to say that this other family's values were worse than ours. It's just they're different. And so every dollar you spend, you're making, whether you go to the supermarket. Oh, so now I'm going to talk about the second one. So these are just different sorts of value-based decisions, right? And every penny you spend is, in some way, it is a religious act. So let's say that you're making the decision between buying meat processed at a factory farm plant where, you know, the chickens receive so many hormones that they can't even stand up straight for the entirety of your life. Or chicken that's produced free range, grass fed, you know, they come with a resume or something, and you know that they've had the happiest life possible. Well, that organic free range chicken can cost 3 times as much, I'm sure, 4 times as much as the mass produced chicken. That is a values based decision. And sometimes when I'm working with congregants and I'm pitching to them tithing, you know, giving away 10%, which is very hard when you don't grow up in that culture, I say, you know, you can take the differential between the two chicken prices and apply that to your tithing. It's not technically, like, this is a little extra legal, but I was like, that is a values-based decision that you are making. Buying fast fashion versus clothing that takes longer to make, that costs 4 times as much. All of these things are values-based decisions. You know, in Judaism, we believe that our money does not belong to us. It belongs to God. Now, we are the stewards of it, and we have free choice as to how to use it. But every penny that we spend is a sort of is a way of being in conversation with how to be more godly in this world.
I wanted to get to that, the steward and the. I mean, man, it's even stronger to say, Rabbi, to say it's a religious act. Like, that language is really, really great. I feel like this rift in all of us, where our use of capital is no longer connected or aligned with what we say we believe, or what we actually believe, like what's important to us. They're like they're separate discussions, and I feel a little bit like maybe my grandpa. I would imagine my grandpa knew the banker that lent him the money for the mortgage. And I would imagine my great-great-grandpa probably traded some real, like, almost like life energy, like worked really hard to make a thing, went to a market, looked the other person in the eye, and traded his thing for their thing. And there was this direct connection between our use of capital and our values. And now it's just zeros and ones, right? There's no, and you're pointing to a wisdom tradition that is still trying to make that connection. How do we lose the plot?
Can I blame capitalism? I mean, there's something about rampant late stage. By the way, Jewish tradition believes in a market economy. This is not like I'm not like some like communist, you know, rabbi coming on, but like, there is something about the way that capitalism shows up in this moment that totally devalues the community in favor of the individual, right?
Yeah.
The individual, that one person is the most important, right? Shareholder value, which is, I know, more than one, is the most important. Then, and like the most distant, maybe not even second, third, fourth, fifth, 10th priority is how it is showing up, how whatever decisions we're making financially is showing up in the actual community. Like, I do think that there is something about the global economy that intensifies this feeling, right? As you said, Carl, like, we no longer know the people who make our clothing. We no longer know the people who kill our chickens. We no longer know, like, we are so disconnected from the people who produce the goods that we then purchase and consume, that it is hard for us to hold compassion, to hold a sense of compassion or a sense of values-based decision-making around how we interact with them. I can't help but think that's true. And that's why I do want to have more and more conversations about money. I mean, like these wealth inheritors that I hang out, that I get to teach, who choose to spend a year talking about how to give away money and all of the feelings about it, rather than just like putting on their blinders. I mean, that is a real choice that I am, there's a certain way that I'm in awe of it, because the way our society is set up right now, it encourages people to disconnect from community, right? This is the whole Robert Putnam bowling alone way of thinking, and just connect to consumerism. You never have enough. There's always, you never have enough. There's always something else to buy. You're always in the second row. There's always someone in the first row, and you need more, more, more. Yeah. It's really heartbreaking. And I'll just say one last thing. Sorry, Carl.
Yeah.
One last
you're
thing,
fine.
which is that, you know, in the Jewish tradition, that everyone is supposed to give away 10% of their post-tax income, as I said. In fact, in our legal tradition, if someone is so poor that they actually can't give away 10%, then the community is supposed to give them money so that they can give away their 10%. It's like part of human dignity. And the most that you're supposed to give away is 20%, because there is a fear 2,000 years ago that if you give more than 20, you could go bankrupt. But I think the ancient rabbis never could have imagined this world that we're living in right now, where there's such wealth disparity between the rich and the poor. And some people have, you know, $50 billion. And so giving away 90% of that would not affect them in the least, like that. Right. So I do think those laws have to change a little.
Right. Tell me about your favorite. I'd just love to hear your favorite. Like, is there any great stories from the Jewish tradition, old sayings from rabbis or old stories? Like, what's your favorite insight about money and wealth? And you can have more than one if you need to.
I have one that I teach all the time. And so just know that in Judaism, we look at texts as always being alive in a certain way, right? The text, the words and the letters don't change, of course, but the way that we understand them. And so there's this great text from the Talmud, which is a legal series of books from about 1,500 to 1,600 years ago. And so the question the rabbis like to ask questions and answer their own questions. The question they ask is, who is wealthy, right? Like what does wealth mean? And then, of course, you have 4 answers, right, from 4 different rabbis. One says, Rabbi Meir is one whose name is Meir. He says, anyone who gets pleasure from their wealth, right? A wealthy person is anyone who gets pleasure from their wealth. So that's just someone who's like able to be happy with what they have and just use it for good and use it for joy. Okay. Another rabbi, his name is Tarfon. He says, anyone who has 100 vineyards and 100 fields and 100 servants to work in them. So Tarfon is much more like how we understand wealth today, right? There is like a certain amount, $1 million, $1 billion. I'm sure before you and I die, it'll be $1 trillion. And that is defined as wealth. You have people who work for you, you own land, right? So that's the second rabbi. The third rabbi, his name is Akiva, says, anyone who has a wife whose actions are pleasant. So, okay, we're in the male gaze right now, but this idea that's like, wealth comes from your relationships. It comes from love, right? Yeah. We all know people who say that. Yeah. And the fourth is, this is Rabbi Yossi. He says, anyone who has a bathroom near their table. Now, that one is my favorite answer because it's like, what the heck is Yossi talking about in that moment? And there's so many different understandings. Maybe it's like, I don't know, if like you're eating and your stomach becomes upset, there's not the indignity of having to run to the outhouse, or maybe that is a sign of wealth. You know, it's like, I remember when my husband and I bought our first house where we had a bathroom that was like a guest bathroom, right? Where like we didn't use our own personal bathroom. So when guests came over, we didn't have to put away all of our towels or whatever, right? Like, you know, who knows what the bathroom comment is about, but still it's saying something, I think, cultural about his moment. And so this is my absolute favorite text because of course Jews wouldn't give one answer to what is wealth or who is wealthy. Of course they would give 4. And of course we should always give 4, but we should always be in conversation about it. There is no one good answer.
That's so great. I remember having my favorite financial planning meeting ever with a client was, it was a long discussion, and one partner was very vocal and the other partner just sort of was sitting there for a little while. And after a little while, we asked the other partner, like, what does it mean to you? And they said, I just want to be able to buy good cheese and not worry about it. Right. And you're just like the practical, like, nature of that, and really close to a very personal value.
But that's such a great answer, because it's like, that's the great Jewish textual answer. Because why? Is it because they want to be able to serve it to other people? Like,
right.
Is it that they want, is it because like they love cheese so much? Is it because bad cheese upsets their stomach? Like, who knows, right?
Yeah.
So I just like, I wish that we lived in a world where we really could talk about this. And I taught my kids know exactly where the 1% starts, and like where they live in Washington, D.C., where their family members live. Like, they know all of these things because, we inhabit a certain sort of like lefty culture, where everyone's always talking about the 1%, the 99%. And I always say to my kids, y'all, our family is much closer to the 1% than you think, right?
Yeah.
Like, they think of the 1% as like, private airplanes and whatever, home theaters. And I say to them, you really need to see how money actually moves in this world.
Yeah. How would you define, how do you think about enough financially? And you can't tell me cheese.
No, Carl, this is a really hard question, because I don't think Jews do a good job with enough. I think part of our tradition is we are a yearning tradition. We are always yearning. And I think it shows up around money. There's sometimes the feeling that there's no amount of money that's enough. It also shows up in quite beautiful ways. I mean, there is no amount of social justice that's enough, right? Like, often when there are social justice movements, you will see Jews, even if it's a movement that, like, there aren't, thank God there's a minority of Jews in America who are Jews of color, but certainly the majority of American Jews are white people. But you'll see a lot of white Jews show up in movements for racial justice, because there's not enough racial justice. It shows up everywhere, our sense of yearning. There's not enough. We spoke earlier about sort of right setting and repentance. Like, you should always be reflecting on how you show up in a world to make sure that you're showing up with like kindness and compassion. And so when you say, like, what does enough mean? Like, my heart drops a little, because I actually wish that we Jews had more teachings about enough. And if you want to know what I really think, Carl,
yeah,
I think that in America, where we have been living with plenty, where Jews have been living with plenty, unlike in most of our history, I think in America, there's a solid number of Jews who have turned to Buddhism. They're called Jubus. And because Buddhism does have a beautifully developed concept of enough.
Yeah, that's exactly what I wanted to ask you about, actually, was you're using this term yearning. I almost get the sense that you're using it in a positive, it feels positive to me a little bit. I've been, and I don't know if I got that right, but you are perfect, you are enough, and you could be a little more tomorrow. Like, I think of that with my relationship with my wife. My relationship with my wife's in the best place it's ever been in 30 years. And I sure hope it's better tomorrow.
Yeah.
And I that yearning piece, the way you said it, is there something there that's more positive than, and then how does it conflict with contentment and non-attachment? And, like, we've always thought the goal was to get to the point where there was no lack. Maybe the goal of human nature is to continue to push a little bit. I don't know.
Look, Judaism is a very communal-based religion, right? Like, the idea of the individual as an individual in and of themselves, an individual in and of themselves. It's just like, you have to have 10 people together to pray. You have to, you give your money to tzedakah, to the wider community, and so on and so forth. And so the idea of enoughness, we certainly have teachings that say, who is happy? The one who is content with their lot, right? That is a Jewish teaching. It's a very well-known Jewish teaching. So the thing about Judaism being thousands of years old is that you can find a teaching that like gives you whatever answer you want, that gives you the answer to whatever question you're asking. But when I'm talking about like Jewish culture and sort of the Jewish zeitgeist, there is a sense, like for instance, let's look at books, right? So on this screen, you and I are talking to each other. You can see behind me 1/1000th of the books that I have in my house, right? Everywhere you go, every corner, there's another 50 books, right? Always learning more. That's another type of Jewish yearning, right? Like we are always yearning to learn. Why? At a certain point, don't we know enough? Like why? I mean, really, when you think about it, but no. It is a rare Jew who ever stops learning, right? And so it really shows up. And I do think that this world is so broken. And this is a little bit of like Jewish sadness, right? Like a little bit of pessimism. Like the world is so broken that when you say to me, is there a moment of enoughness? My first gut answer is no, there is not, because the world needs us to heal it. Right. So when it's just about money, like, of course, there's a moment of enoughness like that is fine. I'm fine with that in terms of our money. But the truth is, then you can, Peter Singer this whole conversation up and you can talk about, well, no, there's never enough money, because if I could make $1 billion a year as a hedge fund manager and give away $990 million of it every year, imagine what I could do in this world. So maybe in messianic times, that's where we'll get to enoughness. But we're certainly, it's just, we're the Jewish psyche, and this also can be connected to internalized oppression, but the Jewish psyche is one of like, we are fighting until our dying breath. Like we are fighting, and it shows up in negative ways, right? It can show up as greed, but it also shows up in quite beautiful ways as well. Like we care for the other, no matter who they are, no matter, to a certain extent, no matter how much they love or hate us, like we care, and we are going to build a healed world.
That's amazing. Yeah, it's really, really, really fun discussion. Speaking of sort of enough, you are involved in communities in Washington and have been involved in Aspen, or soon to be involved?
I have been working at a synagogue in Aspen, Colorado, the Roaring Fork Valley, for the last 3 years, but we're going to be moving out there for a little while in a few weeks.
Tell me about the I'm really curious about a congregation, a community of people in wealthy communities. I happen to live in a resort town that has become wealthy, and we live on the proverbial wrong side of the tracks in the town. You know what I mean? There's me like explaining away like you did earlier.
Yep.
How is it different? Like, what have you seen in terms of wealth among, how does abundance change the way people show up to their spiritual lives?
I want to answer your question, not specifically just about the Roaring Fork Valley, but also about, a lot of these, because I've worked with a lot of communities of wealth. And I think one way that it shows up is that just about everyone who's not in those communities expect that the people in these communities are going to show up different than people in other communities. And the answer is they don't, right? Yeah. People are people. But I love, Carl, that you did clue into a really important word in terms of this community that I'm serving in the Roaring Fork Valley, which is abundance, right? When there is, in the Roaring Fork Valley, we have a few things going for us. One is we have an abundance of time. You have actually people who have made a decision not to live in New York, not to live in LA or in Houston, right? They actually choose to live in a place where the primary value for a lot of people who live there is being outdoors, being with their family, not working 70 hours a week. So we actually have an abundance of time in a certain sort of way, which is quite unexpected and really wonderful. And we do have a sort of abundance of resources. And, not as much as people think, like still a quarter of the students at our Hebrew school get financial aid, because there is always more diversity than one would think, especially in Jewish communities. I know that people think, oh, Jews, well, that Jews are rich, but that's not that's not universally true. So,
Right.
so there is that sort of financial diversity. But what is true is that having abundance allows us to be welcoming in ways we never could have imagined, right? We can have unlimited food at our Sabbath dinner so that all who are hungry can come and eat. And I mean that literally and spiritually, right? We can bring in some of the best musicians from around the country to lead our services with us. And so we really can have spiritual uplift in ways that I do not take for granted at all.
Yeah.
We also have the ability, there's the joke, I don't know how it works in the LDS church, but in Judaism, there's a joke that if you have two Jews, you have three opinions. And one thing we can... Do you have that in your church as well?
No, but we should.
So one thing we are able to do because of this abundance is, all right, Jew A wants to do A, like let's help figure out how to make A happen. Jew B wants to do B, let's help figure out how to make B happen. And then everyone can come together across, for instance, the Sabbath table. So there is abundance, but it's a certain kind of abundance that there's an abundance of ideas that we get to have because we can afford to bring in thought leaders from across the political, religious spectrum to come teach us. That also is something that it is a privilege that we do not take for granted. So there are all types of abundance that do come from having financial resources, but it's not just like we get to build fancy buildings. Like our synagogue doesn't even have a fancy building. We live in a church. And we instead choose to spend our money on sort of funding the people, funding the youth, funding the experiences, rather than funding the place.
Do you find, is there any sense of, there's this old term affluenza. Do you find, because even in your description that sounds so joyous and connected, are you noticing any sense of loneliness that is more or less unique to those communities? I noticed that here in Park City, Utah, that because everything else is so great, there was often this, I called it silent suffering. There was often this thing underneath because it was like, I'm looking out the window right now, like, how can I complain? Do you find that to be the case with that kind of abundance around?
Yeah. So I do, I did read somewhere that Pitkin County, which is the county that Aspen is in, has one of the highest rates of suicide in the country.
Fascinating.
Right? There is a type of loneliness. There is a type of loneliness that can come upon our people. But what is a better antidote to loneliness than a church, right? Yeah. Than a good church or a good synagogue,
and
right?
Community,
then community. Like, what is a better? So my whole life, my whole job is to help counteract affluenza. And I do think that one thing that a church or synagogue, and other groups can do this too, but especially a religious community can do, is it can welcome in people intergenerationally and across difference with much fewer expectations. You don't have to pay. Like, you don't have to pay to be a member. I mean, we have membership, but if you can't pay, welcome in. No one has to know. Like, the first question that you ask someone is not, where do you work? It's instead sort of, tell me about your family or your people or yourself or what you love to do. And so we do, but the people who I know in Aspen spend a lot of time thinking about how to keep their kids from this type of affluenza. And it's really, really hard. So I was just talking to a congregant who was traveling home for the Yom Kippur holiday, right? And it's a 1-day long holiday, but it starts in the evening like Christmas does. And their kids were in school and they needed to figure out how to get to their brother's house on the East Coast in time for the holiday to start. The only way to do it so that their kids wouldn't miss too much school was to take a private plane. And so but they prided themselves, they don't fly private with their kids because that to them feels like teaching them values that they don't want their kids to learn. But yet, here's a different values clarification, right? Their brother was hosting Yom Kippur. They wanted to be with their brother. They wanted to, I mean, it's really complicated.
Mm-hmm.
So they took the private plane and they took the time on the private plane to have a full conversation about the whys, the wheres, the hows. And so one of the things we do in our community is we don't pretend that this affluence doesn't exist. We that is not our way. Our way is to call it out, not in a bad way, to say, yeah, and then say, okay, what are we going to do about it?
Love that. Yeah, it's so good. Well, Rabbi Shira, as we wrap up, I have just one last question. I'd like you to pretend for a minute that it's 20 years from now and I'm still doing this show. Right? Congratulations to me.
That would be wonderful. I will still be a listener. If you're still doing it, I will still listen.
Perfect. And we have your daughter who's now 18 on. And so she's now 18. So 20 years from now, she's 38 years old. We have her on. What would you hope she would say about her relationship with money at that point in her life?
It's interesting that you know, I have 3 kids, Carl, and it's interesting that you asked specifically about my youngest because she is the most culturally different than the rest of us in terms of her use of, in terms of how she, in terms of her money values. She cares a lot more about fashion than the rest of us do. She cares a lot more about like makeup and those sorts of things. And so I'm glad that you asked about that one specifically. So she's 38 years old. Her goal in life is to be an OBGYN who specializes in underserved Spanish-speaking populations.
Wow.
But she also wants to marry someone. She wants to make very little money, but she wants to marry someone who makes more. I mean, she's very clear about these things. She's 18, so we'll take it from there. But what I want her to say more than anything else is she takes every dollar seriously. Like she doesn't waste her money, that she gives away as much as she can and then some, that she sees that money is a way of being of service in the world, and she is in for it. That's what she wants to do. That money is not something to be quiet about. It is something to talk about with her friends, with her siblings, with her parents, God willing, will still be around. And that however much she has been given over the course of her life, she wants to give away even more.
That's amazing. I'm looking forward to that conversation. Yeah. Well, Rabbi Shira, thank you so much for taking the time to have this conversation.
Carl, thank you so much. This has been, we say in Judaism that there are rebbes, like rabbis, and chassids, like students of the rabbis. And I am a chassid of yours, Carl. Like I'm a chassid. I'm a student of the way that you force us to talk about things that some people consider difficult as a way of building a better world. So thank you.
Oh, that means a lot. Thank you very much. One of the reasons that I started this show was because I wanted to fundamentally change the way I feel about money. Been looking for different perspectives. I've been traveling around the world for the last 20 years, talking with people about money. And I have these conversations that have just changed in a minute the way I think about money. And one of those happened in this episode. Rabbi Shira said something that completely blew one of my assumptions wide open. You see, I've had this assumption for as long as I can remember that more money equaled more problems. That money was a burden. Right? In fact, I was so sure of that I even said to Rabbi Shira, all the wisdom traditions have said that. I've used confirmation bias to convince myself, right? I had a belief, more money equals more problems. I've gone around collecting evidence that that's true, right? Even to the point of saying all the wisdom traditions said it. And Rabbi Shira, which was a beautiful conversational tool, by the way, she just simply said, I'd like to investigate that a little bit. She didn't say she disagreed. She didn't say she wants to push back, which would have been fine too. She said, I would like to investigate that a little bit, right? She said, I don't think we say more money, more problems. I think we say more money, more possibilities. And I can feel the grace of that assumption. I realize since this recording, I've been thinking about this a lot, that I've been walking around as if money was a threat, right? More money, more problems, stay away, more. It's not. And of course I know that. Of course, it's a tool. Like, I'm the guy who's been talking about money for 20 years in a newspaper and all around the world. Of course I know that. But this landed in a way that it hadn't before. What if it wasn't more money, more problems? Do I really believe that? Like, imagine the difference in your relationship with anything if you thought of it consistently as a problem versus if you think of it consistently as a possibility or even a tool, like we've talked about in so many episodes. If I believe that money is a tool, or in this case, that money is possibility, that's a much different relationship than if money is a problem. I'm not sure the impact that statement had on you, but it has shifted, shifted the way I look at money. More money, more possibility. And with that, my friends, thank you for listening to another episode of 50 Fires, a podcast about money, meaning, and what matters most. Until next time, cheers, my friends.
The views, information, or opinions expressed in the series are solely those of the individuals involved and do not necessarily represent those of Chip and Joanna Gaines, Binel Audio, nor Magnolia.